and I quote, of my study of the Church's liturgy, particularly the relationship between culture and liturgy. After years of tinkering with this delicate topic, I still ask myself, what relevance has enculturation for the post-conciliar church? Does it strengthen faith? Does it nourish love? And does it shepherd hope? I realize that such musings on enculturation have become idle and unprofitable in some church quarters that seek to reform the reform willed by the Council and implemented thereafter. Dark clouds are forming ominously on the western horizon. They move hurriedly and decisively toward the direction of the sun that bursts radiantly in the sky. They cast upon it the somber shadows to hide it from view. Suddenly it is dusk before the appointed time. This is how I would like to describe the state of liturgical reform some 50 years after the Second Vatican Council. The reform is being put to task by a movement known as the Reform of the Reform. It carries an agenda that can have a regrettable impact on the liturgical gains of the Council. The agenda is an attempt to retrieve discarded liturgical practices, sometimes at the expense of active participation. Proponents of the movement call it hermeneutic of continuity with the Church's worship tradition. By tradition, they mean the Tridentine rites, which the Roman Church jealously safeguarded for 400 years. My name for this movement is Romantic Historicism. It severs the ties of liturgy with culture. Has the liturgical reform of the Council failed the Church so that a new reform is now needed? What would be a reasonable gauge for the usefulness and validity of the conciliar reform? My answer is the reception by the local churches. I speak about a reception that is global, especially among developing nations and continents. In a quarter of a century, the post-conciliar reform had taken deep roots in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Oceania. There, in the span of 30 years, I had a first-hand experience of vibrant but prayerful liturgical celebrations. I always say, if you want to see the world, be a liturgist. In October 1984, convincing testimonies of the worldwide success of the reform were read during this Convention of National Liturgical Commissions, which was organized by the Congregation for Divine Worship. I venture to say that it is a myopic appraisal of the post-conciliar reform to view it largely from the spectrum of some traditional churches. It is desirable that the critics of the liturgical reform take time and effort to experience the global church, especially outside the Northern Hemisphere. I'm sorry, I'm speaking to people in the Northern Hemisphere. Please understand that I belong to the equator. They should realize that the Church is indeed Catholic and embraces a variety of approved forms for celebrating the liturgy. Culture has something to say about differences in liturgical rites. In Asia alone, the style of celebrating the liturgy varies according to the religious culture of the people. Catholic faithful in India and Thailand are comfortable with contemplative environment for public worship, but we, the islanders of the Philippines, value festive and joyous songs, gestures, and symbols. I suggest that when we evaluate the merit of the post-conciliar reform, our chief criterion should not primarily be whether or not the Reformed liturgy of Vatican II is in continuity with medieval tradition represented by the Tridentine rites. The issue about rupture of liturgical tradition is a polemic question that overlooks the history of the liturgy, which time and again has undergone adjustments in textual and ritual expressions. The true issue is whether the post-conciliar reform has promoted the Church's earnest desire that the faithful worldwide are led to full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations. I think it is a type of elitism to claim that the Tridentine liturgy is still the only effective means for all the faithful in the world to enter into the mystery of Christ. It is a narrow view to regard the culture of medieval liturgy as the perennial culture of the universal church. Now that the Tridentine liturgy has been officially declared as extraordinary form of Catholic worship, the two forms should remain distinct from each other. A combination of elements derived from either will result in a hybrid liturgy that will certainly cause confusion among the faithful. The two forms are intended to coexist, giving to each of the faithful the right to choose which liturgical form suits best their religious needs. For this reason, Pope Benedict XVI wisely and prudently allowed the bishops of the diocese to establish a personal parish where the Tridentine rituals may be used. Thus, I can see no cogent reason to reform the Reformed Liturgy of Vatican II, using the criteria of Trent. We owe the 1970 Missal and the worldwide Catholics that claim it our respect. In a word, let us leave the Reformed Liturgy of Vatican II alone and insist rather on how to foster greater interiority in its celebration. But dark clouds are forming ominously on the western horizon. They move hurriedly and decisively toward the direction of the sun that burns radiantly in the sky. They cast upon it the somber shadows to hide it from view. Suddenly, it is dusk before the appointed time. At a conference held in Rome on Summorum Pontificum, a high-ranking prelate revealed that Pope Benedict's easing of restrictions on the use of the 1962 Roman Missal is just the first step in a reform of the reform. According to him, the Pope's long-term aim is not simply to allow the old and new rites to coexist, but to move toward a common rite that is shaped by the mutual enrichment of the two mass forms. And I quote his statement. In fact, he says, Pope Benedict knows well that in the long term, we cannot stop at the coexistence between the ordinary form and the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, but that in the future, the Church naturally will once again need a common rite. I am reminded, as a liturgical historian, of a historical tidbit that might shed light or cast shadow on the future of liturgical enculturation. In the 8th century, the pure or classical Roman liturgy migrated to Germany. There it merged with the local Franco-Germanic liturgies noted for drama, allegory, symbol, and piety. The result was a hybrid Roman-Germanic liturgy, which the German popes, Clement II, Damasus II, Leo IX, Victor II, and Stephen IX, introduced in Rome in the 10th century, and which quickly eclipsed its classical liturgy. In 1072, a Benedictine monk was elected pope. A Roman by birth, Pope Gregory VII wasted no time to restore what he called Ordo Romanus, or the traditional liturgy that had existed in the city of Rome before, and I quote his words, before the Germans took over its government. However, his effort to eliminate the Germanic accretions had little success. The liturgical reform of Vatican II, on the other hand, is closer to the mark. But only time can tell when the reform of the reform will at last deflect it from its target. Dark clouds are forming ominously on the western horizon. They move hurriedly and decisively toward the direction of the sun that burns radiantly in the sky. They cast upon it their somber shadows to hide it from view. Suddenly, it is dusk before the appointed time. In reality, however, the dimness is caused by the passing clouds. I am confident that these cannot put back the clock to yesterday's evening hours. Thank you.